welcome everyone to this panel about international practices in catch-up and recovery. We have a panel of 4 speakers who will be talking about the practices on catch-up and recovery in their respective countries. In Belgium, Christophe de Witte, Megan Kuhveld from the United States, Michael Gratz from Switzerland, and Anne-Fleur Kortekas from the Netherlands, from our own research institute, Learn. And I've asked them to prepare 2 questions. The first one is, what measures are being taken by schools or local and national government to address potential learning loss of students, or at least the kind of loss of schooling? And are there opportunities, measures to build back a better system? I do ask you to share questions in the chat or comments, and we'll hopefully can take some of them. The time is quite short, but we'll do our best to engage with you as much as we can. So let me share Christophe's slide first. And maybe, Christophe, you can also introduce yourself a little bit and your area of work. Can I give the floor to you?
Definitely. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending this conference and for the invitation of the conference. I'm Christophe de Witte. I'm a professor at Leuven Economics of Education Research, the Faculty of Economics and Business of University of Leuven. And I'm mainly working on education and looking at education from an economic perspective. And so, of course, this pandemic is a brilliant opportunity for education researchers to study education and to study what is the impact of the pandemic. So Melanie, you can go to the second slide, because to answer the 2 questions that Melanie just presented, I would like to set the scene a little bit first, because in Belgium and in Flanders, there is quite a bit of evidence on how the pandemic impacted children. So first, there was a study that I did together with Joanna Maldonado, in which we look at the impact at the end of primary education. And we looked at standardized test scores of the private education provider to see that there was quite a bit of impact on both reading, social sciences, math of children at the end of primary education. So just to give you an idea, the average impact was about 0.20 standard deviations, which is quite large. Then we also looked at personality traits. So how did the COVID crisis influence different students? Because typically we look at socioeconomic status and the background of students, but of course students, they experience this COVID crisis also depending on their personality traits. And so that's what we did. So we looked before the crisis in January, not because we had what kind of vision on the crisis, but simply because of another experiment where we measured in a very precise way the students' backgrounds. And so we knew whether they were extroverted, introverted, and how the personality of the student looked like. And then in June of the same year, in 2020, we asked them how they experienced the crisis and how they estimated their impact on student learning. So these were 2 of the studies, but there are also other studies by the public education provider, by textbooks, etc. And if you go to the next slide, Melanie, then you can see that all of this evidence, so both quantitative and qualitative evidence, that is suggested quite a big learning loss due to the crisis. And so in addition, we saw that also the inequality, so the spread in test scores between students, also increased both within schools and between schools. And in Belgium and in Flanders, we already have quite a bit spread inequality in test scores. So this was even enlarged due to the pandemic. And so we saw that this negative relationship, this negative impact of the crisis in terms of learning losses and inequality, that this was even bigger and larger in schools with a lot of disadvantaged students, that schools which were already lagging behind in terms of test scores, that they were more seriously hit. We also saw that if we compare it now to other evidence abroad, that in Flanders, we were not ready at all for the pandemic. So we didn't have distance learning tools, as students didn't have ICT equipment. So our estimate of learning losses are typically a bit higher than what we see abroad. And then finally, our reports here is measured in June. So we measured the learning losses immediately after the crisis. In a novel report that should be published soon for the European Commission, we also try to differentiate between when does the learning loss, when did people measure this learning loss? And we see that all of the evidence which was measured immediately in June is typically a bit higher in terms of learning losses than what has been measured before, later on, so in September, October, and more recently the novel work by Carla Haldermans and colleagues. So we see that there is also a differentiation in there. But just to set the scene indeed, because yeah, there was quite a bit of evidence and this evidence was quite severe. And that's why, if you go to the next slide, Melanie, that there was quite a bit of effort from policymakers in Flanders just to compensate this learning loss. So there has been a lot of measures taken for ICT, a lot of funding for ICT. About 340 million euros, for instance, just to buy hardware, to buy software, just to create a kind of professional development for teachers. There were also additional teachers hired. There was additional funds for student counseling. There were summer schools both in 2020 as well as in 21 now. There is additional effort for tutoring, in a way, just to have this kind of one-to-one and even small group tutoring. So there's quite a bit of effort by the Ministry of Education just to build back what we had lost due to the COVID pandemic. And if you go to the next slide, then I try to put it into perspective. So this is again from this report that will be published soon for the European Commission. But here we try to summarize what has been done in different countries and what kind of additional money has been spent due to the COVID-19 crisis. And you can see that for Flanders, for instance, we spent quite a bit of additional money, so about 4% increase in the education budget per pupil, simply to recover the learning losses. And so this is definitely due to this well estimated learning loss that we have. You see the same pattern in the Netherlands. This comes back in a moment, I guess, but also in various other European countries, we see quite a bit of additional spending due to the corona crisis, like in Italy, 3%, like in Portugal, 13%. So in many countries, they had quite a bit of effort to build back the learning losses. And so finally, to answer your last question, Melanie, on the final slide here, yeah, this is taken from a slide that I presented in the Flemish Parliament, where I tried to propose also a Flemish build back and build better strategy, building back just to recover the crisis, and building back just to take the crisis as a kind of opportunity. Because of course, in Flanders, as in the Netherlands, as in many other countries, we are declining gradually over time in terms of the PISA test scores, in terms of TIMSS test scores, etc. And this crisis can be a kind of opportunity to build the education system in a better way. And so if you go to the link on the bottom of the slide, you will find quite a bit of evidence, unfortunately in Dutch, but on how we can create parental involvement. How can we, try to make sure that we can also reach the parents? How can we reduce inequality in the system, but also teacher professional development? This was very low in any international comparison before. So we need to have more incentives for teachers to get professionalized. We need more ICT, but also the curriculum. So this is quite a bit of discussion nowadays in terms of the curriculum. So we need more focus in the curriculum and making sure that pupils don't have a kind of great retention now in June, but that we focus on what they didn't grasp and make sure that this works. And then finally, as a last point of the strategy, we should have more accountability for the schools. In Flanders, there is few accountability for schools. So standardized tests, which are about to come, are definitely necessary, but also policy making capacity of schools are necessary just to build the system back in a better shape than it was before. So this was just in a very brief overview, I hope within 5 minutes, to show you that there is quite a bit of funding in the Flemish system, and that this is really the moment to build the system back, but also in a better way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. That was really helpful. And there is a question about sharing the link in the chat, so maybe you could do that in the next presentation as well. I guess a question that I also have is, in the Netherlands, there has been quite a lot of discussion about the use of the terminology learning loss. and quite a lot of pushback of schools in saying, well, it kind of speaks to a very economic argument around education and a very high focus on student outcomes, and this kind of rat race that that students need to be catching up instead of thinking about education as a kind of holistic development over a period of time. Is that something that do you have a similar discussion in Belgium, perhaps?
Yes, so we do have a similar discussion. I don't think it's that strong as in the Netherlands, but of course this learning loss, as I typically label it, it consists of various bits. So the learning loss is first of all because, yeah, students, we couldn't reach them at school, and so they lose a little bit of automatism, so they lose a bit of learning, very similar to the summer loss effect. So just a long holiday also has an effect of 0.18 standard deviations on average. So that's one component, and that's not a loss as such. So that's why also in the studies that measure the effect of the COVID-19 crisis in September and October, that they typically find lower learning losses than what you see in June. Second, there is also the effect of having less instruction time. If you close schools and if you have online learning, there is less effective instruction time. And this as such also has an impact. It's estimated 0.6 standard deviations per week by some studies. So this also has an effect simply because you don't reach students, you can't practice them. And if you can see them online, you typically have just a theory while they don't fully grasp the concepts, while they don't fully grasp the differences, etc. Then there are also the personality traits. We saw in our study that introverted students, they were quite happy at home, whereas extroverted students, they were getting a lot of stress. The same holds for stressful students, neurotic students, etc. So there was quite a bit of difference. And so this average here that we estimate, yeah, this hides quite a bit of difference between both socioeconomic status and personality. And then finally, also in June, it's not a real loss in some sense, but in earlier years, there was quite a bit of practicing for those tests, which due to the school closures was not the case. So in that sense, yeah, learning loss is a kind of overarching concept, but it has various concepts and various elements in between there.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Apologies, I have to leave it to that. Otherwise, we don't have time for the other presenters. There is a question in the chat for you. Maybe you can answer it in the chat as well. And I'd like to invite Megan now to talk about the United States.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk. I'm going to try to speak really briefly about a wide variety of things that have been happening in the US. My name is Megan Kufeld. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, where the sun is just coming up. So apologies if I'm a little bit not quite presentation ready, but if you could go to the next slide, please.
There we go.
Thank you. So we have done some studies at NWA looking at the pandemic learning, including a study that was released in the fall, and we'll be releasing another study next month that have tracked students throughout this last school year. And our findings in the US, the study that I conducted primarily was focused on grades 3 to 8. And we found actually, in looking at their fall test scores, and we found fairly promising evidence that students were continuing to make gains in reading, but had shown some large losses in math. And we use the term unfinished learning here because of that pushback that you mentioned to learning loss was very prominent in the US. And a lot of teachers and educators felt that the term learning loss was not reflective of all the efforts that students and teachers had gone to through this year. So we landed on unfinished learning, but this is kind of an ongoing discussion of how best to reflect this kind of multifaceted concept that Christophe was mentioning. But one of the biggest findings from our study was that there was a whole lot of missingness. So we were only capturing a percentage of the students who would normally be testing. And we've seen a lot of evidence in the US of high absenteeism rates and students just kind of dropping off altogether, not remote logging in to remote school, and teachers not being able to get a hold of them. So we were concerned that even these kind of somewhat promising findings that we were seeing were really an underestimate of the true impact of the pandemic so far. So in terms of what the United States has been doing as a recovery, we've had a few different federal laws passed in the last 6 months that increased the funding for education by a really kind of huge amount. With some of it, I believe 20% earmarked explicitly for learning loss and programs that states and districts should be implementing to really focusing on catching up students. And these plans that districts had to come up with, really the timeline is very short. They have to spend a lot of money and not that much time. And that may change, but right now the strategies that have been primarily used are not necessarily the ones that I think have the most research backing, but are the ones that districts can actually implement quickly. So far, a lot of that money has been, in terms of the reviews of the plans that have been done so far, that it's been a lot of hiring and shoring up budgets for teachers, as well as trying to hire additional counselors and specialists to really help with some of the mental health impacts of the pandemic, which have been fairly large. There has been a lot of proposals to implement a large-scale tutoring program, but so far that hasn't really been rolled out in the United States in any sort of meaningful way. Some districts are doing it, trying to increase tutoring access locally, but it hasn't really been it has been talked about a lot, but not as much implemented in districts so far. And one of the other things that has really come out when districts have reviewed, when researchers have reviewed district plans so far, has been this focus on acceleration rather than remediation. So really trying to avoid holding students back and repeating prior grade level material, but focusing on grade level content and then filling in holes when needed. And this, is kind of it's a strategy. It's not totally clear to me what this looks like in practice and how different that is from normal practice, but this term acceleration rather than remediation has been kind of a hot topic, and really trying to focus on not, avoiding holding students back has been really a policy change that I think has become more popular in the pandemic. And then the final thing I'll say about the recovery, there has also been a lot of money spent by districts and states to increase access to technology and trying to increase access to Wi-Fi, though that's kind of out of the control of many school districts to make sure internet access is increased. But that's been a huge issue in the pandemic, is unequal access to high speed internet and to devices. So that's something that school districts initially in the spring of 2020 spent a lot of time trying to get devices to students and purchasing some of these software for learning online. But that rollout has been has looked really different in different districts with, I think, different levels of success of using some of these online tools. So if you could go to the next slide, please. In terms of building back better, I think probably many of these suggestions are ones that will come up in other places. But the United States has really huge inequalities in both the number of teachers, the kind of quality of teachers, as well as access to other services within schools, such as school counselors and mental health, with many high poverty schools having something like a counselor serving 200 students or 500 students in the school. And that's something that I think some of this money should be spent to really fix some of those inequalities and make sure that students have more wraparound services within schools to really kind of take care of the whole child and not focus quite as heavily just on the academic side. Because we know that students aren't going to be ready to learn if they're suffering, if they're completely disengaged or suffering from mental health issues resulting from the pandemic. There's also been a lot of talk about whether or not we should continue offering remote options this coming school year, because some students really enjoyed them. And that's something that, many districts are opting out of, but there's been some discussion of whether states should offer, instead of each district. In the United States, we have about 13,000 school districts. So making some options that maybe aren't run by the district, but give families more flexibility for the families who've really enjoyed remote learning and found that worked better for the personality of their students. Finally, I think prioritizing social emotional learning investing in out-of-school enrichment opportunities, so not just summer school, but summer, kind of more camps and other things that give both childcare for parents who work full-time, but also give students enrichment opportunities after school or during the summer, can help build back a better system. So I'll stop there. I haven't really been monitoring the chat, but I don't know if we have time for questions or if I should just stop.
Yeah, there is one question from Janet Looney asking about whether there was any kind of discussion around which areas of the curriculum needed to be prioritized in accelerating learning. I know that you have the Common Core curriculum in the United States, right? So
yes.
Has any kind of discussion around which areas of the Common Core curriculum needed to be prioritized?
Yes, so I know that there have been conversations. I don't think it's happened at, it hasn't resulted in revising the curriculum, but I know that many school districts have tried to hone in on which of the Common Core standards in a given grade level are really the essential components for being able to have mastered that grade level content and trying to teach those more heavily. But it's been, from my understanding, somewhat of a hodgepodge of, rather than kind of coming to a collective agreement on what those standards, those key standards are. It's been more kind of at the district level. But I think that is a big part of, if you're going to do acceleration, you need to you can't prioritize everything the same way, or you'll never, move through all the content.
Great. I'm just trying to find the next presentation by Michael Gratz. Maybe Michael, you can start introducing yourself while I'll pull up your slides.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Michael Gratz. I'm a sociologist, mostly working on the factors influencing and explaining the intergenerational transmission of advantage, such as education, occupation, and income. And I work at the University of Lausanne and also at Stockholm University. So I thank you for the invitation to be on the panel. I'm not really an expert on policy responses, and also Switzerland is maybe not the case where you can most learn from. But there are 3 points I want to make. So the first point is that we had school closures in Switzerland, but only during the first wave. So schools in Switzerland were closed from March 16 till May 11, 8 weeks, and that is it, at least at the national level. Back at that time, we did a study where we were looking at the learning time children spend, the time per week children spend learning, and our contribution was mostly that we were using panel data, which we had collected just before and just after the school closures. And those results, they are quite similar to what we know from studies from other countries, that students learned a lot less during these 8 weeks of school closures. And also we know from a study that colleagues at the Institute for Educational Evaluation at the University of Zurich have done, that the learning loss in terms of test scores was similar to what I've seen for Belgium, from Christoph's work, and from the Netherlands. The second point I wanted to make is that, in my view, actually the most important policy response in Switzerland has been that there have been no school closures during the second and the third wave of the coronavirus. And it's not totally clear why. I mean, why this was one of the reasons is certainly that in general, I think Switzerland was a bit less worried about the coronavirus than other European countries. So the responses in terms of restrictive measures to influence the spread of the virus were certainly less than at least in Germany or Belgium or the Netherlands. And the second reason is also that, at least in this scientific advisory board of the Swiss government, the so-called COVID task force, there were also economists, for instance, Stefan Wolter, who was certainly aware of both the Swiss and the international literature on the learning loss. So I think actually that the schools were not closed again was the most important policy response by Switzerland. And apart from that, at least in my comparison to, I'm usually always comparing it to my home country, Germany, there was a lot less attention in the media and also among politicians about the consequences, actually about both, about the kind of the idea that children were spreading the virus and about the consequences of those school closures. And so there was also no general response at the federal government level to the learning loss. At least those radical ideas that we were putting out in our article. So where we had this idea there was some loss in the instruction time, and that should be compensated by more instruction time, like teaching children on Saturdays or having some summer camps, some teaching during the summer holidays, having shorter holidays, that nothing of this was done in Switzerland. Now you can go to the next slide, please. And then, of course, in Switzerland, the federal government has very little say in terms of educational policy, in any policy actually, but it's the responsibility of the 26 states. It's a bit difficult to have an overview of all these 26 states that we have in Switzerland. But from what I gather from the cantonal website, the focus is really mostly now on how to make sure that the virus is not spreading in school by having all these hygienic measures instead of responses to the learning loss. So what I'm going to say for the rest of this presentation is not based on scientific, countrywide studies. So it's more based on anecdotal evidence from newspaper articles and from my wife, who's working in a school in Switzerland. So there might certainly have been school responses in some way, but at least they were not, not made by a national policy, and they may also differ across schools. But most schools, they seem to believe that there were now no long-term consequences. And what is happening now in schools, now that we are 1 year after the school closures in Switzerland, is kind of business as usual happening before the pandemic. And there are also, that was, I think, your last point. So it's the third point, and I wanted to make some positive consequences that at least are pointed out in these newspaper articles are that there's more possibilities to support individual students through online teaching, and that also this whole crisis had put more attention to the importance of teachers, which are not always the most valued professions by the public. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. That's really helpful. The positive points, it's really good to have those as well, because we tend to talk about the negatives only, but obviously there are positives as well, particularly in how also teachers have really learned how to use IT to support teaching and learning as well. So I think that's one of the biggest positives of this pandemic potentially. And I know that in the next keynote, Pak Tiung will talk about that as well. Hi, and great to see you here as well. We have 5 minutes left, so that leaves Anne Fleur with the final words about the Netherlands. Can I ask you to continue?
Definitely, yes. I'll share my screen with you. Let me see whether this, no, this is not. Separate recording. Thank you, Melanie. I'll shortly introduce myself as well. I'm assistant professor at educational sciences at the VU and researcher for the Learn Research Institute, where I'm also, together with Melanie and many others, responsible for the evaluation of the catch-up programs in the Netherlands. And beside that, I am the coordinator of the academic teacher program at the VU. And today I'll shortly tell you something about the main measures our government has introduced since the start of the pandemic. And I'll tell you about the so-called catch-up grants and the National Educational Program. In the Netherlands, we've had 2 periods of school closures. For primary schools and preschools, these lockdowns lasted for 8 weeks. And in secondary education, school closures were followed by a 3-month period of online lessons combined with actual classes, mostly 1 day a week. And last week, many of these secondary schools fully reopened again. In the Netherlands, we have a largely decentralized system with a high level of school or school board autonomy. And this means that the government offers grants and schools can apply for extra help, extra hands, or extra materials. And shortly after the first lockdown in March 2020, the Dutch government opened the so-called catch-up grants. In total, a little less than 6 million euros was invested to allow schools to offer extra help to those students who needed it most after the school closures and also during the next period of lockdown. And schools with a larger number of students at risk for learning losses could apply for more money, for example, for 20% instead of 10% of their students, or for all of their students in the Caribbean. Funds were distributed in waves, and schools could apply in multiple waves. At the moment, we are in the application phase of the 5th wave, and schools were and are flexible in design and execution of the programs. Participation of students is voluntary, but was not allowed to be during regular instruction hours. However, we see that many schools organize the extra support during school hours. So not during instruction, but during school hours to increase participation. And many, if not all, schools combine these catch-up programs with means from other grants. For example, grants to reduce workload or to invest in later selection in the transmission from primary to secondary education. Positive of this type of policy making is that because of the large amount of school autonomy in the execution of the programs, extra support can be adapted to the school context and built on existing partnerships. And in our current evaluation of the programs, we see that schools profit from existing partnerships and expand existing programs instead of always making new programs, implementing new programs. However, this type of investment is only short-term, means have to be spent directly, which was also mentioned by Megan. And in the Netherlands, we have a large shortage in teachers and school leaders. So this makes it harder to implement the evidence-based interventions that we want to implement. It's also a hard to reach target group, and many schools are trying to combine different grants, and sometimes we see some reinventing of the wheel. Schools, we also see, and I think this was also mentioned by John Kay, that schools are overreaching. They are trying to address all student needs. They offer multiple programs to improve both cognitive and socio-emotional functioning. At the moment, we are, our government is implementing the National Education Program. The Netherlands invests 8.5 billion euros, of which 5.8 is invested in primary and secondary education, and 2.7 in vocational and higher education, which comes down to at least 700 euros per student for their upcoming academic year, and a little less for the year after. Schools have to make a so-called school scan, which is the diagnostic part that John Kay also talked about, where they inventarize possible learning delays and the impact of the pandemic on socio-emotional well-being. And this inventarization is the starting point of an extension of the school plan that is developed in schools as we speak. And our government has constructed a manual of effective interventions, largely based on the EF Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which is adapted to the local context and expanded with interventions relevant for the Netherlands. And this is where we stand right now, together with the investment that both government and the scientific community are making in building a stronger infrastructure to stimulate evidence-informed catching up. The but here as well is that still the investments are not structural, although it is a lot of money. It keeps schools from hiring teachers on a long-term basis. And we still have the large shortage of teachers, and the time span is very short because schools are just reopening and local lockdowns due to COVID infections are still day-to-day practice, which makes the time span, according to some schools, too short. I'll go to the next slide, which is about opportunities. And I already mentioned it.
Anne-Fleur, can I ask you to highlight one point because we're over time?
Yes, definitely. I think the point that I would like to highlight, maybe the appreciation of teachers, but also the improved cooperation between schools and scientists, which we see in the high number of webinars, the websites that pop up that really support evidence-informed working in schools. So that will be it then, Melanie. Thank you.